So, afternoon again. Obviously, you've already heard from me, but in this hastily rescheduled part of the event, we're going to be discussing references and reference managers. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how and why we reference things before giving you a discussion about the reference management software, including hopefully a flawless practical demonstration about using reference managers with a couple of different ones. Now we're testing things. Nope, of course, the notes don't work properly. Fab. So why exactly do we reference? What is our motivation behind that, other than just because we're told that we need to? So if anybody has any suggestions of why we should reference, please do stick those into the chat. So I will give, obviously, since I'm asking for input, a little bit of time for people to chat. Put anything in the chat if they want to. Obviously, as I am going along, please do feel free to put any questions you have in the chat, although, of course, oh, there we go. There's the chat. It had just disappeared. So do feel free to put any questions into the chat. If I see them, I might attempt to answer them as I go along. If not, hopefully I'll have time at the end of the presentation to cover them. We also sometimes use the term citation or citing when we're talking about providing references to content. So I may also use those terms as well throughout the presentation. It's somewhat interchangeable with referencing. So some of the reasons why we reference. So the main one is to provide attribution to the work of others. So this may be because you're sort of directly quoting somebody's work, describing previous work that's gone on, or other like sources of work that you've been doing. So that's a really key aspect of it. As I can see in the chat, some people are putting some great things in. So some of these obviously we've got. So providing evidence and giving credibility to the claims that you're making, that's a really key reason why we would reference things. To give people further reading. Hopefully, if they're reading your work, they're also interested in the topic, so they'd like to read more about it, so that can give them places to go and find more information about what you're writing about. One of the key things is also to avoid plagiarism. So it's really important to consider sort of academic integrity, especially when in the context of assessed work, which a lot of you as potentially students will be covering. I'm not going to go into that specific area in this presentation, but it's definitely a key topic that should be looked into. So as a general rule of thumb, if something isn't common knowledge, so basically you can assume that somebody will know it, which varies dependent on the context in which you're writing. And if it's not based on your data results or opinions, then you should be referencing it. It does also depend a little on the context of where you're putting it. So in this presentation, you'll see we mostly provide links rather than fully formatted references. This is because the type of resource that we're pointing to, but also the informal nature of this presentation. If we was instead writing an article or a paper, I'd be putting them in a proper formal reference style. So where are some places that you might go to find? So the first place that you probably want to start is doing a literature search, and an obvious place to start with these is an institutional library. From there, you can branch out into literature databases. And there are a number of different platforms. Some are openly available. So you've got Google Scholar and Core on here. Those are openly available. And some are subscription-based. So Web of Science and Scopus, those are two subscription-based searches. In addition to this, you can also set up alerts on several of these platforms, so they can notify you when new research is published that meets your criteria. This is particularly useful if you're working on a project with specific keywords. You can also go down the rabbit hole of references in related papers. This can sometimes lead to you having hundreds of interesting papers that you'd want to read, but it's a really useful place to find papers relevant to your interests. And then if you're looking for domain-specific knowledge, you can always use subject databases such as the CAS SciFinder. So I'm going to go quickly just a little bit about the different types of references. There are so many different types of references, many more than we could possibly cover in this presentation, but these are ones commonly encountered in the physical sciences. So we've got white literature, which is often referred to things in formal publishing, so books and journals. Grey literature generally covers most things kind of outside of those traditional ones, conference papers, reports, press releases, fact sheets, websites, which can vary from very sort of formal and structured websites down to something temporary or that somebody has put on maybe a blog or something like that. It's also becoming much more common to have data as its own citable output, where you will actually be able to reference to the specific data set rather than potentially a paper that might have contained some data. And then alongside that, there are other things such as software and images, which are also becoming more commonly citable. And another factor in doing this is also to consider licensing and reuse. So it's not specifically necessarily about referencing as such, but it's particularly important, especially around like images and data, which again, I won't cover that in this presentation, but it's definitely worth looking into if you're going to be using or looking into using data and images from other sources as to how you are able to reuse them and how you attribute those. So a key thing about a reference is that you want it to include enough information that if somebody else were to pick up your reference list, they would be able to go and find the specific resource that you were referring to. A lot of these requirements for what needs to be, what's stipulated to be included, varies between the resource type and also the reference style that you're going to be using. And these are all mandated in the style guides for those specific styles. But in general, they include names of authors, titles, publishing places, the date. And also, in addition to this, for a lot of the newer resources, it's possible to include a DOI. So this stands for a digital object identifier, and it's an identifier that will uniquely identify a record. Most frequently, I've encountered it when talking about online journal articles, but it allows a reader to easily locate that specific article. So where possible, I advise trying to include those in your references because it's really helpful when you're reading the reference list to know exactly where to go to find it. So I'm going to give a couple of examples of how we use a reference. So most of the time, you'll probably be doing this when you're writing a paper, maybe your dissertation or a report or something like that. And most of the time, you're going to be using an in-text citation. So this is where the identifier for the item. So in this case, you can see the braces with the numbers 1 and 2. Those are the identifiers for the references. They're included in the main body of my text. And then the full details of the source is then included in a reference list at the end of the document. So that's the section in gray on this specific example. So the exact formatting of this identifier and reference list varies depending on the reference style. You'll hear that quite a lot throughout this presentation, but it is always the same. It always depends on which referencing style you're using. So obviously, so these are two examples of an in-text citation and their reference list entries. The first is for a journal article, in fact, something from my PhD research, and the second is for a book section. In both of these examples, I've used the ACS, so that's the American Chemical Society referencing style. And you can see it includes the names of the authors, the titles, year of publication. And in fact, in both of these cases, it does actually provide that DOI that I mentioned, which allows the reader to easily locate the resource. In some cases, you can also present a list of sources that have been used as background reading. Somewhat confusingly, this and the reference list are both often referred to as bibliographies. But when doing the list of sources, they're not necessarily items that are referred to at a specific point in your text. but just sort of things that have been used as background information. Commonly, you might find these at sort of at the end of a book chapter, or potentially alongside a module as kind of further reading lists. So as I have alluded to, a lot of things depend on the referencing style you're using. There are a lot of them, probably far more than you could ever need. But in the sciences, a number of the popular styles are, so the American Chemical Society, there's the American Institute of Physics, Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineers, the Royal Society of Chemistry, and Vancouver, but that's mostly used in sort of medical sciences. So another common referencing style that you're likely to encounter is the Harvard referencing system, although generally this is less used in the physical sciences. Most of these referencing styles that I've listed there, they all present their references as numbered in the in-text citation, so how I presented the examples on the previous slide, rather than using the author date format, which is how the Harvard referencing style will present it. But different journals or different departments in the different domains will give a different requirement for how they expect the references to be styled. So do make sure you check. Most of them will produce a style file or a style guide, and that will detail for a lot of the different resource types, how they expect the resources to be referenced, including the exact formatting. So what has to be in bold, what has to be in italics, where the commas should come. So do read those and try to like abide by them where possible. However, obviously, it's not necessarily the easiest thing to do when you're working in a project. You've got hundreds of different resources. There might be journal papers, books, different data like objects, and you want to keep a record of all of those. So if you just tried to manually do that all, maybe you stuck them in a Word document, you were trying to make sure you were abiding by the reference style, and then you realized actually you needed to use a different reference style, you're going to find that really tricky. And especially if you want to try and find a paper, but you can't remember all the details about it, it's not a fun way to spend your time. So you can use a reference manager as a system to help you manage your references, as it says in the name. So these are programs that can collate a variety of different resources all together, allowing you to better organize them. I don't know if anybody has used a reference manager before. If you do already use a reference manager, why don't you put which one you use in the chat, and maybe something you either find good or bad about it. So I'm going to be covering just quickly a couple of the different aspects of the 3 different reference managers available. So these are Zotero, Mendeley, and Endnote. And Sammy is a Zotero fan, and we've got a Mendeley user as well in there. So these reference managers, I mean, to a large extent, they have a number of similar features. So you can come down to how comfortable you are about using them, or maybe what you have like access to through your institution, because that might, obviously, if you have a subscription to it, that might be the software that you use. They'll allow you to capture information from the web when you're doing a literature search. Often this is combined with auto captures of PDFs and metadata about a resource, so you don't have to manually enter all the information. You can also search your reference library, group references, and tag or annotate them to give extra information around the reference. As I mentioned, there are a huge number of reference styles. And the reference managers can help you to easily switch between the different reference styles, and they'll automatically produce the reference list in that format. And you can also work collaboratively on a reference library with colleagues in a lot of the reference managers. So I'm going to quickly do a demo attempting this. Hopefully nothing will go wrong. We'll see. I'm going to go through kind of using the different stuff and a couple of different ways of doing it, getting it into Word, things you might need to use. So the first one I'm going to sort of cover is Zotero. They have a number of different ways to access Zotero. This is an open source software. I personally now use Zotero. I have used Mendeley in the past. I used that during my dissertation and PhD, and I've switched to Zotero sort of in the last year or so. Their main interface is the desktop software. They do have a web importer plugin and also a plugin to do Word insertions. It is completely free. If you do the web sync, though, you get a sort of free allowance, and then above that, you will need a paid account. They do also have Zotero Bib, which is a very lightweight web-based referencer, but it's not really recommended if you're doing a big project or reusing resources, because their desktop software is much better for this. So I am quickly gonna try to switch over. Fingers crossed this does all work. So I'm just gonna open up Zotero. So here, so this is what Zotero looks like on their desktop kind of app. You can see this is my library. I've got lots of different resources in here. You can see it will say about what the title is, authors, and some of the other metadata around the resource. And you can also see if I click the info tag instead, here it shows it in sort of more full metadata associated with it. So first of all, I'm going to show you how to import something into your library. So if you imagine, and of course, this is like the last tab on my thing. If you imagine I'm doing a literature search and I've come across a paper that I think is interesting and that I'd like to keep a record of. So I've read this and decided it's good. I can use one of the web importer plugins. So up here, I've got the Zotero plugin. There's also a similar one for Mendeley and also for Endnote. So they're all pretty similar in terms of what they can do. I can click to allow it to save it, and you can see it's saving it into my library. It's also going to go away and it's going to grab or attempt to grab when it gets colored, it'll done it. So it's now grabbed the full text PDF. And on some of them, it'll also grab a web snapshot, especially when it can't get the PDF. So now if I return to my Zotero library, you can see here, I've now got a new entry in my library, which is the article that I was just looking at on the web. And it's also under here, it's got a full text PDF, so I can see the actual full article in its PDF format. Over here on the right-hand side, you can see it's picked up a lot of the metadata around the thing. So this is what we talk about with auto capture. But what you really need to be careful about is that it has actually captured that information correctly. A lot of the newer journal articles, they are more likely to be correct, but often I've had in the past with older journal articles completely incorrect metadata, and also sometimes missing or incomplete metadata or slightly wrong metadata. Also sometimes, like if you're looking at a web page and the web page is showing a book reference, it might capture the metadata for the web page itself and not the metadata for the book that you actually want to have it for. So I advise checking all of this metadata at the point at which you capture it, rather than at the point that maybe you want to use that reference or you're making your reference list. It's much easier to do it and have your reference library all correctly sort of set up. So I'm just gonna switch back. So to the correct bit. So Mendeley has a lot of similar features. Again, a desktop software, two different versions of desktop software, in fact, a Word plugin and also a web importer. This is also free for their the base plan, but above that you need above a certain storage limit, again you'll need a paid plan. And then also there is Endnote, which is produced by Clarivate. So this is a subscription-based software. So you can only access their desktop software through a subscription, which a number of institutions do have. So if you have access to that through your institution, you can use that. They do have an Endnote web version, which is free. and Endnote Click is their sort of plugin for using on the web. They also have a importer for Word. So I'm just going to open up Mendeley to sort of show you how a library looks in Mendeley desktop. So here you can sort of see I've got, again, a number of different documents. You can sort of click on it, and here you can see that it's, again, got lots of metadata associated with it. You can sort of see like the types of it. You can also, in addition, in both like the softwares, in addition to importing it from the web, you can also manually add an entry, and then you can create this new thing by selecting which reference type it is and then manually adding the metadata. This is really useful if obviously you can't import it from the web, or it's something that isn't available on the web and you need to manually create it. You can also import sort of documents or references in sort of different formats. These are formats that are commonly available to you through sort of journal papers as a way to download it. And you can also put them into folders to organize them, and also put sort of notes about them, or also in Zotero. It will allow you to tag the article. Here it's automatically added tags that are associated with that paper, but you can also manually add some tags. So I'm just quickly going to shift over to Word. So here I have a report that I am writing. You can see, obviously, I've got a lot of my text in here. I've started to add a couple of references into my document, but I've got other references that I want to add. I tend to leave myself reminders about adding references using what's called a citation key. Usually these are formed with the the primary author and the year in which it's published. These are also commonly used in BibTeX and LaTeX. So if you come to our version control and LaTeX event, we'll be talking about those a little bit more. So that's usually what I give myself an identifier, because you need to know which citation it is you want to add. Word does have its own citation manager, but unless you're only doing a couple of citations, I wouldn't advise using it. We have here the Mendeley plugin. There's also an Endnote plugin, and I'm going to use the Zotero plugin, which has its own little tab here. So I just click up here to add a citation, and then it pops up this box. I start typing. As I type the correct thing in, you can see it filters my library, and here Butler 2005, that's the paper I'm looking for. I'll just add that in, click enter. Once it's processed it, you can see it's now created a number 2, and actually some of the references I had later down, they'll now have renumbered because it's inserted a new citation. And then I can just go to the end of my document, and if I don't already have the reference list added in there, I can just add in a bibliography, and it should, yay, it worked. See here, this is the most recent one I added, number 2, but you can also see I had a couple of other references already included in there. So these are using, should be using ACS. So here you can see document preferences, and you can select from a number of reference styles. You can also add new styles to them. It varies between the different reference managers, but you can usually just switch between those, and then it will reformat how your bibliography is done. It will also, if necessary, change your references to sort of being in the numerical format to being in sort of a name and then year format. So that's pretty much it for what I'm going to show in the demo. That was a bit of a whistle-stop tour of what you can do in some of the reference managers. They are very powerful, and there are a lot of features that you can do in them. So just play around with them and have a go. In addition to capturing the stuff from the web using the tools that I mentioned, you can also add stuff like the Google Scholar button that can be added to your web browser, and you can also get citations directly from journal websites, often in like a formatted citation or in those .bib or .ris files. But again, do make sure that you are getting the right information and that it's not capturing the wrong information automatically. So all of these reference tools do have the ability to do collaborative referencing. They have different forms of how they do that. So groups or private groups. You can also edit a BibTeX file, which sort of underlies these databases in a shared folder. This is quite advanced, but if you come to when we talk about LaTeX, we'll go a little bit more into sort of how you do referencing using BibTeX. All of these links and stuff, the sources will be available after this event. So obviously you don't have to try and get those down right now. But just sort of to round up, what are a few top tips? Save the references as you are doing your searches, but don't expect it to always get the right information necessarily automatically. You shouldn't just blindly trust that what it's getting down is correct. So make sure you do those, fix those when you get the references down. This should be obvious, but I'm going to say it here anyway. Don't reference something that you haven't read. Make sure that everything that you are putting into your references is something that you have actually verified and read, and not just sticking it in because everybody else references it or because somebody told you to stick it in. So yeah, that's a key part. Check which style file or style guide you should be using, and then make sure that your reference manager supports it. If it's something you're going to be using for like a year's worth of reports, if your reference manager doesn't support it, then either see if it can support it, or maybe think about using a different reference manager to make your life easier. And since Sam made a comment earlier about having lost several years of references, back up your reference library, because once you've spent a lot of time creating your reference library, you don't want to have something sort of come along and corrupt it, because that's a lot of work and you don't want to lose it. So where can you go for more information? So the primary place I'd say go and have a look for information, university libraries. A lot of the universities provide openly accessible guides to how to do referencing. I've linked the Southampton one here. They have some excellent pages on some of these guides on how to do things, how to use some of the reference managers. Referencing style guides, I've included a few links in the sources at the end of this. There's also a good subscription-based website called Cite Them Right. Some institutions will also have access to this. So if you do have access, it's worth checking those out. And then also the reference manager user guides. They're quite good to go and see as well. So I think the end of this is just some further reading sources. So obviously I will put those links sort of in the slides. I might just make the full slide deck available. Yes, check out our other events.